Regret is the only ghost that truly haunts a house. The words echoed in the empty room as the soft sound of the ocean waves lingered in the background, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. Fujimoto sat at the edge of the table, his back hunched, the weight of his years reflected in his posture. The chair opposite him remained empty, an unspoken space where his daughter should have been, yet was never truly there. His fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the table, as if holding on to something, or perhaps letting go. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, watching the ocean stretch endlessly into the distance, yet he saw nothing. The sound of the waves, once a comforting lullaby, now felt like the relentless ticking of a clock, marking the moments slipping away from him. He had long since abandoned the notion of peace, trading it for control, for the illusion of order. He thought of the days when he could have been present, when he could have looked his family in the eyes and truly seen them, but he never did. The years had worn him down, just like the ocean worn the rocks into smooth, unrecognizable shapes. The mask he wore, of a cold, unfeeling father, was the only thing he had left to hold on to, a shield against the emotions he couldn't afford to feel. Across from him, Sosuke played with a plastic toy, his small hands moving quickly, his face innocent, unaware of the storm that raged inside his father. Sosuke, with his innocent smile, wore a mask of his own, a shield against the unknown, against the fear that had been carefully hidden from him. The father's silence was his shield, just as Sosuke's curiosity was his armor. Neither of them could yet see the fractures, the cracks in the facades they had built. Fujimoto's mind wandered back to the days when he could remember the warmth of his family. It was a fleeting memory now, like the last embers of a fire that had long since burned out. He could almost hear Lisa's voice, soft and steady, telling him everything would be all right. But it never was. The weight of his promises to her, the promises he couldn't keep, lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow. He had told her once, before the ocean had consumed him whole, that he would always protect their family. But in the end, he hadn't protected anyone. He had built walls, not bridges. He had kept his distance, assuming that by keeping control, by keeping things locked away, he was doing what was best. But now, as he watched Sosuke, something in him cracked. The boy was too young to understand, yet he had already started to piece together the truth that Fujimoto had tried so desperately to bury. The silence between them grew heavier, each passing second a reminder of what had been lost. It wasn't just the years, the days, or the missed opportunities, it was the bond they never had, the love they never spoke. Fujimoto let out a long, shaky breath, his body sagging as the weight of everything he had buried came rushing to the surface. His hand slid from the table, resting at his side, as if he could no longer hold it together. He glanced at Sosuke, who looked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes, not understanding the pain in his father's gaze. For the first time in years, Fujimoto wanted to speak, to say the words he had held inside for so long, but they caught in his throat. His body betrayed him, collapsing under the weight of regret. He didn't have the strength to say it, but he knew now, in that moment, that the silence had cost him everything. Sosuke, still oblivious to the depths of his father's pain, reached out to him, but the hesitation in his small hand was palpable. Fujimoto watched, frozen, his heart aching with the realization that this moment, the one he had been avoiding for so long, was slipping away. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could make this moment count. The sea outside seemed to pause for a moment, as if waiting for him to find the words. But no words came. Instead, all he could do was sit, silent and broken, watching his son's small hand hover in the air. Maybe, for now, that was enough. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the room, yet inside, the coldness remained. Fujimoto sat in the same chair, his hands now resting on his lap, the faint tremor still present in his fingers. He could feel the weight of the day pressing down on him, the exhaustion from years of isolation and silence that he had allowed to fester. The space around him seemed to shrink, suffocating him with its quiet. Sosuke had retreated to his room, the small sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, leaving Fujimoto alone with his thoughts. He thought of the years he had spent building walls, each brick carefully laid in place, each layer of distance more fortified than the last. He had thought that silence, that control, would keep everyone safe. But now, the silence felt like a death sentence, a constant reminder of everything he had failed to protect. He thought of Lisa, of how she had once told him that love was meant to be a bridge, not a wall. But he had never truly understood what she meant. He had spent so many years convincing himself that love was about sacrifice, about doing everything for others without ever asking for anything in return. He had forgotten that love was also about connection, about sharing the burden of pain, of vulnerability. He had buried his emotions deep, thinking that they were too dangerous to face, too dangerous to show. But now, as he sat there, he could feel them rising to the surface, bubbling up from the depths where he had shoved them away for so long. It wasn't just the guilt that had been building over the years. It was the fear of being seen for who he truly was. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his own realization pressing harder with each breath. He thought of Sosuke again, of how the boy had looked at him earlier, eyes filled with confusion and uncertainty. Fujimoto had always believed that protecting Sosuke meant keeping him safe from the world, from the dangers that lurked just beyond their door. But in his attempt to shield his son, he had unknowingly shut him out. And now, as the darkness of night settled over the house, Fujimoto couldn't help but wonder how many years had been wasted, how many moments he had missed. He could almost feel Lisa's presence in the room, as if she were sitting beside him, whispering the words he had never been able to say aloud. He had failed her, failed their family, failed Sosuke. But it wasn't too late, was it? There was still time to make things right. The thought brought a sense of calm to his otherwise chaotic mind. He could feel the heaviness of his regret, but now there was something else, a flicker of hope, however faint. He was no longer alone in his silence. He didn't have to carry this burden by himself anymore. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of forgiveness, not just from others, but from himself. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier finally found their way, slipping down his weathered face as he whispered the words he had never thought he would say. "I'm sorry." The room, once suffocating and cold, now felt like it was breathing again, each exhale a release of years of tension. As he sat there, his body trembling with the weight of it all, he knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he was willing to face it. He was willing to open the door he had kept closed for so long, to let the light of forgiveness in, to rebuild the bridges he had burned. The storm that had raged in his heart for so many years was starting to calm, and with it, a sense of peace began to settle in the deepest parts of his soul. The night was still, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner, a constant reminder of normalcy, of the life that continued despite everything else falling apart. Fujimoto sat in the same chair as before, but now there was a subtle change in the way he held himself. His back, once hunched with the weight of his years, was straighter, less burdened. The storm inside him hadn't completely passed, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the winds were dying down. He glanced over at the table, where Sosuke's toy still lay. It was a simple thing, a plastic figure, but it had been the symbol of everything he had been trying to hold together, the connection between them, the unspoken promise that he would protect Sosuke, even if it meant burying his own emotions. Now, as he looked at it, he saw something else, an invitation. The invitation to change, to open the door to the truth, to stop hiding behind the walls he had built. His eyes moved, slowly to the window, to the world outside that had always seemed so vast, so unpredictable, a reflection of the turmoil inside him. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the heavy clouds, but there was a sense of calm in the air. It was as if the world, too, was waiting for something, waiting for him to finally let go, to allow the healing to begin. The thought of Sosuke crossed his mind again, and for the first time, Fujimoto felt a deep sense of regret not just for the past, but for the future that had yet to be written. He had spent so many years caught in the struggle to control everything around him, to protect his family in the only way he knew how. But now he realized that by doing so, he had lost something far more precious than the sense of security he had been trying to build. He had lost the connection, the love that had once been so pure, so untainted. A wave of guilt washed over him, but it was different this time. It wasn't the crushing weight that had held him back for so long. This guilt was quieter, softer, but it carried a truth that he couldn't ignore. The truth that he had been living a lie, that the silence he had used to protect his family had instead driven them further away. He stood up slowly, his body protesting the movement, but this time, he didn't care. This time, the ache in his bones was a reminder of the steps he still needed to take, the journey that was just beginning. He walked across the room, each step purposeful, each movement filled with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. As he reached the door to Sosuke's room, his hand hesitated on the doorknob. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unsure of what he would say, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But then, with a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. Sosuke was sitting on the bed, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the nightlight casting gentle shadows on the walls. Fujimoto stood there for a moment, unsure of how to start, but then he saw it. The same trust, the same innocence in Sosuke's eyes that had been there all along. It was a trust that had never wavered, despite everything. Slowly, Fujimoto sat down beside his son, the space between them smaller now, the distance between their hearts beginning to shrink. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he spoke the words that had been stuck in his throat for years. I've made mistakes, Sosuke. I've spent so many years trying to protect you, to keep you safe, but in doing so, I've pushed you away. The words felt strange, unfamiliar, but they were real. And for the first time, they felt like the right words. Sosuke looked at him quietly, not yet understanding fully, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity. Fujimoto's heart swelled with something close to relief, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. In that quiet moment, the storm inside him calmed a little more, and he realized that healing wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about taking the first step, about facing the truth, and about being willing to make things right, no matter how long it took. The room felt heavier now, but it wasn't the same kind of weight that had crushed him before. It was the weight of acceptance, of truth, of finally understanding that some things could never be undone, only learned from. Fujimoto sat by the small window, staring out at the dark, the ocean a blackened mirror reflecting the few scattered stars above. The cool night air drifted in through the cracks, but it did nothing to ease the warmth that had spread through his chest. His mind was still wrestling with the enormity of his actions, the years lost in silence, the time that had passed without connection. Sosuke was asleep now, tucked in bed, his quiet breathing a soft comfort in the otherwise still house. Fujimoto's heart swelled with a mixture of guilt and tenderness as he thought of the boy. He had always assumed that protecting Sosuke meant keeping him safe from harm, from the chaos of the world. But he had failed to realize that protection wasn't enough. Love was the real shield. And love meant being present, truly present, even when it hurt. He stood up slowly, his body still stiff with the weight of years, but this time it was different. He wasn't walking toward another isolated corner of his mind. He wasn't retreating into the silence that had defined his life for so long. No, this time, he was walking toward something, toward the possibility of a different kind of future. It wasn't a grand gesture that would fix everything, no miraculous moment that would erase the years of emotional distance. It was smaller than that, quieter. It was about showing up, day by day, in ways he had neglected before. As he walked across the room, his mind returned to that moment with Sosuke earlier, the simple act of sitting beside him, speaking the words he had kept buried. The connection had been tentative, fragile even, but it was there. It was real. He knew it would take time, that the walls built over years wouldn't fall overnight. But the first cracks had appeared, and that was enough for now. Fujimoto stood in front of Sosuke's bed, looking down at the boy's peaceful face. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to just look, to take in the life in front of him without the constant pressure to fix, to protect, to control. Sosuke's small hand rested on the pillow, fingers curled slightly, a quiet symbol of trust and hope. Fujimoto's throat tightened as he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The boy had trusted him despite everything, despite the years of silence and distance. It was a trust he didn't deserve, but it was there, unwavering. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Sosuke's forehead, a silent promise to do better, to be better, even if it meant facing the discomfort of vulnerability, of truly being seen. He stood there for a moment, just listening to the quiet, letting the silence fill him not with dread, but with peace. The future was still uncertain, still filled with unknowns, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally ready to face it. The burden of his past mistakes hadn't disappeared, but he was no longer carrying them alone. In the stillness of that room, with Sosuke asleep in his bed, Fujimoto felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that, for the first time, he was willing to walk into it with open eyes, ready to embrace whatever came next. There was no magic formula, no quick fix to undo the damage, but there was something more powerful, the willingness to try again, to rebuild, one step at a time. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and forgiving, casting long shadows across the room. Fujimoto sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, the steam rising in gentle spirals that seemed to mirror the quiet calm inside him. The house, once filled with an oppressive silence, now felt different, lighter, as if the weight of unspoken words had finally begun to lift. He glanced over at the empty chair across from him, the place where Lisa used to sit. The absence of her, though painful, no longer felt like a wound that would never heal. It was more like a scar, a mark that would remain, but one that had started to fade, softened by the passage of time. Sosuke had left for school, the sound of his little footsteps fading into the distance, but the quiet that remained now felt like a space for something new, something better. Fujimoto closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness, allowing himself to be present in it. For years, he had been too consumed by the noise of his own thoughts, his own regrets, to ever truly hear the world around him. But now, he could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside, the distant hum of life moving forward. He had spent so long running from his own feelings, so long burying the parts of himself he didn't want to face. But in this moment, he allowed himself to sit with the discomfort, to acknowledge the pain without trying to push it away. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but not an unwelcome one. The past few days had been filled with small, tentative steps toward connection, between him and Sosuke, between him and the memory of Lisa, and, perhaps most importantly, between him and himself. It was a slow process, this healing. There were no grand gestures, no miraculous moments of clarity. It was in the quiet conversations at the dinner table, in the moments when they didn't need to say anything all but still felt the bond between them. It was in the way Sosuke had looked at him the night before, not with fear or confusion, but with something more, something that felt like understanding. Fujimoto smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling with the faintest trace of joy. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in years, that was all he needed. The door creaked open as Sosuke returned, his school bag slung carelessly over his shoulder, his face flushed from the walk home. He dropped his bag on the floor and plopped down at the table beside his father, his eyes bright with curiosity. Fujimoto couldn't help but notice how much the boy had grown in such a short time. It seemed like just yesterday he was a child, wide-eyed and innocent, but now there was something in his gaze, a maturity that had come too soon, perhaps, but one that was undeniable. Sosuke picked up a slice of bread and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully as if trying to figure something out. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "Dad, I think I understand why you did what you did." Fujimoto froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected those words, not yet. But there they were, spoken so simply, so matter-of-fact. He looked at Sosuke, searching his face for any sign of the confusion that had once clouded his eyes. Instead, he saw something different. A quiet acceptance. A recognition of the things Fujimoto had done, the things he hadn't said, and the things he had tried to shield his son from. "I don't know everything," Sosuke continued, his voice steady, "but I think it's okay. I think we're okay." The words hung in the air between them, a soft weight that felt like both a release and a promise. Fujimoto felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat as the enormity of what Sosuke had just said settled over him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of all the pain and mistakes. It was something simpler, something more profound. It was acceptance. And in that moment, Fujimoto realized that maybe, just maybe, they could both begin to forgive themselves. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a space of possibility, of shared understanding. As the afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows on the floor, Fujimoto finally felt the full weight of the journey they had ahead. It would take time, but he was ready for it. Ready to face whatever came next, without the fear of being judged, without the pressure to be perfect. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the same way they had been before. There was a new rhythm in the house now, a pulse that was steady, not suffocating. Fujimoto had spent so long in the silence of his own thoughts, in the isolation of his own guilt, that it took time for him to understand the difference. But now, as he sat in the small living room, watching the sun filter through the blinds, he realized that the silence was no longer something to fear. It was something he could share, something he could exist within, alongside Sosuke. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, Sosuke walking into the room, his school bag slung lazily over one shoulder. The boy looked at him, their eyes meeting in a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Fujimoto's chest tightened, the love he felt for his son overwhelming him in that moment. But it wasn't the same kind of love that had pushed him to isolate himself for so many years. It was softer, more open, and with it came a deep sense of vulnerability. He wanted to speak, to tell Sosuke how much he had missed, how much he had failed him, but the words felt insufficient, as if no combination of them could convey the magnitude of what he had realized. Instead, he just looked at Sosuke, and in the silence between them, something shifted. Sosuke smiled, that quiet, understanding smile that had once been hidden behind confusion and uncertainty. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a smile that let Fujimoto know, without words, that they were on the same page now, that the distance between them had closed, even if only a little. "It's good," Sosuke said, his voice calm, steady. "It's good that we're talking more. I like it." Fujimoto blinked, the simplicity of the words striking him deeper than anything else could. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of any wrongdoing. It was acceptance. A simple statement of understanding that everything, the silence, the tension, the years of strained connection, was starting to mend. Fujimoto's throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't from sorrow. It was from something else, something more akin to relief. He had spent so many years thinking that if he kept quiet, if he kept his emotions locked away, he would somehow protect his family. But now he understood, he hadn't been protecting anyone. He had been hiding. Hiding from the world. Hiding from his son. Hiding from the simple truths that had always been there, waiting for him to face them. As the day drifted on, the quiet continued, but it was no longer oppressive. The walls of the house, once so full of tension and unspoken things, now felt like they could breathe again. They weren't perfect, not by any means, but they were real. And for the first time in years, Fujimoto felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't the hope of a quick fix or an instant resolution. It was the hope that they could keep moving forward, even if only one step at a time. Later that evening, as they sat together for dinner, Sosuke looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, I think we're going to be okay." Fujimoto's heart swelled. The words he had always longed to hear, now coming from the boy he had spent so many years trying to protect. He didn't know how to respond, except to look at Sosuke and nod, the simple gesture more meaningful than anything he could have said. In that moment, as they shared a meal, as the light outside began to fade into the evening sky, Fujimoto realized that it wasn't about fixing everything, about erasing the past. It was about understanding that the future could still hold something good, even if it wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, he had let the years slip by in silence, but now, with Sosuke at his side, he was ready to rebuild, ready to let go of the ghosts of the past and face whatever came next, together. The quiet of the evening seemed almost unreal, like the world outside had paused, holding its breath along with them. The weight of everything that had happened, the silence, the misunderstandings, the years of missed connections, felt both distant and immediate. Fujimoto sat by the window again, the same place where he had sat countless times before. But this time, he wasn't looking for answers, just for peace. His gaze lingered on the horizon, the darkening sky stretching out before him, a vast expanse that mirrored the uncertainty he felt within. But unlike before, it didn't feel as if the horizon was closing in on him. It felt open, free, filled with the possibility of change. Sosuke was outside, playing with his toy, his laughter breaking through the stillness of the house. Fujimoto smiled softly, the sound of his son's joy filling him with something he hadn't felt in years, relief. It wasn't that everything was perfect, or that they had somehow managed to erase the mistakes they had made. It was the realization that they didn't need to. What mattered now was the willingness to try again, to face each day with the understanding that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that didn't have to be rushed or forced. The days passed slowly, but with them came small moments of connection. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic revelations. Instead, there was the quiet comfort of simply being in the same space, of sharing a meal, of exchanging a few words here and there, of sitting together in silence without the weight of unspoken things hanging over them. They were learning how to live in the present, how to navigate the space between them without the fear of saying the wrong thing, without the anxiety of whether they were doing enough. Fujimoto no longer felt like he was stumbling through the darkness, trying to find the right words or the right actions to make up for lost time. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be there. The storm inside him had quieted, and though the past would always be part of their story, it no longer had the power to dictate their future. One evening, as they sat together at the table, Sosuke looked at him again, the same look of understanding in his eyes. But this time, there was something more. Something that spoke of growth, of change, of the quiet healing that had been happening between them all along. "Dad," Sosuke said, his voice soft but steady, "I think I understand now. It wasn't about what you did or didn't do. It was about the fact that you're here now. That's enough." Fujimoto's heart swelled, his breath catching in his chest. He hadn't expected these words, but in them, he found everything he needed to hear. It wasn't about the mistakes of the past. It wasn't about the years that had been lost. It was about the present moment, the here and now, and the simple fact that they had both decided to be there for each other, no matter what had come before. The weight of everything, the regret, the guilt, the fear, felt lighter in that moment, as if the air itself had shifted, making room for something new. Fujimoto looked at Sosuke, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, he saw not just his son, but the young man who was growing into his own. There were no more walls between them, no more layers of silence. Just two people, sitting together, understanding each other in a way they hadn't before. The evening stretched on, the light fading as they continued to talk, to share, to listen. The world outside continued its slow, inevitable rotation, but for Fujimoto, it felt like they had found their own moment of stillness, their own quiet place in time where everything was okay, where everything could begin again. The morning light streamed through the curtains, gentle and warm, wrapping the room in a quiet embrace. Fujimoto sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, the steam rising in slow, curling tendrils that seemed to mirror the calm settling over him. The house was still, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The weight of the silence no longer felt heavy. It was familiar now, like the gentle rhythm of a heart beating steadily after a long period of turmoil. Sosuke had left for school again, his footsteps fading as he walked down the path. But the quiet that remained wasn't an absence. It was a presence, a space for reflection, for growth. Fujimoto looked down at the empty chair across from him, the place where Lisa once sat. There was no longer the ache that had filled him whenever he thought of her absence. Instead, there was a bittersweet acceptance, an understanding that life, though it had been marked by loss, could still move forward. The past would always be there, but it no longer defined him. It was simply a part of the story, not the whole story. His fingers tightened around the mug, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, savoring the warmth. He thought about all the moments he had spent caught in the past, thinking, regretting, wishing things had been different. But that was before. Now he was here. Now he had the chance to make things right, not by erasing what had come before, but by being present, by showing up. He had learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a daily choice. He had learned that love wasn't just about protecting those you care about. It was about being open, being vulnerable, and being willing to grow together. The past few weeks had taught him that. The quiet dinners, the small conversations, the moments of connection with Sosuke had all built something stronger than the walls he had spent years constructing. The morning light grew brighter, and Fujimoto smiled to himself, a soft, content smile that spoke of peace, not perfection. His eyes drifted to the door where Sosuke had left, and the thought of him brought warmth to his chest. Sosuke, his son, had always been the thread that kept him tethered to something beyond his own guilt and regrets. And now, Fujimoto realized, that thread was woven into something even stronger, something that would carry them both forward, together. The door creaked open, and Sosuke returned, his school bag slung over his shoulder, his face flushed from the walk. He dropped his bag with a soft thud and glanced at his father, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Fujimoto stood, setting his coffee down, and walked over to him. The air between them felt different now, lighter, more open. Sosuke looked at him for a moment, then smiled, a smile that spoke of forgiveness, of growth, and of love. "I'm glad we're okay," Sosuke said, his voice steady and sure. Fujimoto's heart swelled at the words. There was no judgment, no resentment, only acceptance. Sosuke had forgiven him, even without the grand gestures, even without the words that Fujimoto had been afraid to say. And in that moment, he knew that they were indeed okay. The storm that had raged for so long inside him had passed. The silence between them was no longer filled with fear, but with the quiet understanding that they had made it through, together. And that, in itself, was enough. The future wasn't certain, but they would face it side by side, taking each step as it came, learning, growing, and healing. Fujimoto looked at his son, a new sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to fix everything. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. All he needed to do was be present, be real, and continue moving forward with the love and understanding they had found together. The door to their future was open now, and they were ready to walk through it, together.